All right, thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another great show. I have an interview today. I have Robert Wiesner with me, and we're going to be talking about some Second Temple Judaism and I don't know why I'm skipping, having brain fart, but we're having predestination, double predestination in Second Temple Judaism. I don't know why I'm having brain lapses right now, but I thank you for joining me, and I'm excited for this one. This is going to be one that is going to challenge you. All right, this is one that's going to challenge your understanding. So be on the lookout for this one, because I'm excited for this one, and I hope that you are too. As you know, the Gospel Truth is engaging the culture of Christian truth, and we're through that with debates, interviews, and Bible lessons. So I do want to go ahead and encourage you to like and follow the Gospel Truth. Make sure that you're liking, subscribing, and hitting that notification bell to stay in the loop with what the Gospel Truth has going on. Also, all this content is on other social media platforms as well. You can go to Instagram and Twitter. You would probably, if you're watching this from Facebook, YouTube, you know I'm there. But yeah, you can also subscribe or like at Instagram and Twitter. If you're somebody who wants to just listen on the go and don't really care for YouTube or anything, I also have the option of podcasts. All right, so iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. So please make sure that you're flowing over to the podcast and make sure you are subscribing there as well. That said, I do have some shows that are coming up here in the future. And coming up tomorrow, I'm going to be doing this lesson. I've been wanting to do this lesson for a while. And like I've always said, you know, you guys hear me on Facebook and everything. I believe that there is this idea, this Gnostic, not Gnostic, but neo-Pelagianism going on in the church today. And they hide amongst the flock, you know, and unless you know what to look for, the telltale signs, the red flags, you won't be able to tell what they are. So I'm going to be doing this with Pelagianism. And with this, I'm also going to be talking about probably some semi-Pelagianism as well, and go through the differences, what's going on in each of these areas of thought. All right. So be on the lookout for that. Make sure you subscribe, hit the bell for that one so you don't miss out on that one live. After that, I have my friend, my buddy, JD Martin coming on. He's from Exploring Theology. Can Calvinists hold to libertarian free will? All right. So I do believe that me and JD may have to, you know, get in the ring a little bit with this one, but this is my dude, and I don't expect much hostility there. Though he's a great debater, man, so I have to grip myself a little bit with this dude, man. But yeah, we're gonna be talking about can Calvinists hold to libertarian free will, so be on the lookout for that. That's coming up Monday, February 15th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, I have a great interview, a double interview here. I have Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. Michael Licona. They're going to be joining me, responding to objections to the resurrection. These two right here are probably arguably the leading voices when it comes to evidence for the resurrection. All right, so I got two top-notch guys coming on. So we're going to be diving into this, and they're going to be taking some questions and everything. So hopefully on the lookout for that one. February 19th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. It's 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then lastly, I have is Catholic understanding of transubstantiation biblical. All right. So that's going to be Curtis versus Robert, and that's going to be Saturday, February 27th at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and that's 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that's just the next 4 shows coming up here on the Gospel Truth. So make sure you're liking, make sure you're subscribing, make sure you're doing what you have to do to stay in the loop with what the Gospel Truth has going on, because you don't want to miss out on any shows that are coming up here in the future. So that said, I do want to introduce my guest, Mr. Robert J. Wiesner. And I don't want to mess his name up because I saw him on Soteriology 101 with Dr. Leighton Flowers, and Dr. Leighton Flowers said his name wrong. And I don't want to do that, man. Robert J. Wiesner. And Robert J. Wiesner is a graduate of Dallas Christian College, where he earned his BA in Biblical Studies with a Biblical Language minor and Dallas Theological Seminary with a theological master's in theology and New Testament studies. He has served in numerous churches at various capacities, including his children's ministry as a youth pastor, as a young adults minister, as an adult Bible teacher, and as a member of the rotating preaching team. Robert's vision for church ministry is based largely on Ephesians 4 and the apostles' body of Christ metaphor. where we are told that God has gifted leaders for the purpose of equipping and empowering everyone in the church to participate in the work of the ministry to accomplish God's mission in the world. Robert is passionate about expository preaching, in-depth Bible study, biblically informed worship, and the duty of Christ's church to make disciples of Jesus by being salt and light in the world and reflecting God's goodness for his glory. Robert and his wife, Jackie, have a 5-year-old son, Uriah. They enjoy drinking good coffee, eating good food, cooking, reading, family time, and watching the Dallas Cowboys. I had to boo Robert on that one, man. The Dallas Cowboys, no way, man. Can't do nothing with the Dallas Cowboys, man. What's going on with you, Robert? How you doing, man? Robert, can you hear me? Hold on. I think I might have moved myself. Robert, can you hear me?
I hear you now. Yes,
all
sir.
All right. Yeah, I don't know if you heard me before, man, but I was sort of booing you about your Dallas Cowboys at the end of your bio, man.
Oh no.
Yeah, man. I'm a Raider fan, man. Yeah.
I don't think I saw either team in the playoffs. Am I right?
Yeah, I think you're right, man. I think you're right. It's all right though. It's all good. No worries, man. So what's
building?
Yeah, man. So before we jump into this interview, I thank you for joining me. It's exciting. We're going to be talking about some predestination and election, in the Second Temple Judaism, and this is an interesting one because you don't really hear a lot about this, right? You don't really hear about trying to flow Pauline's theology back into extra biblical canon. You know what I mean? So it's interesting, and I'm interested to hear about this. So before we jump into this, man, I just want to give you a chance to sort of go a little more involved of what you got going on, man. What are you currently doing right now as a pastor within the church?
Yeah, so I preach every Sunday, so I do most of my exegesis and theology, which is something I just really love to do for the pulpit. So I find it to be a really fun exercise week in and week out to, work in Greek and Hebrew texts and try to understand, the historical context, the theological meaning of a passage and bring that into a well-organized, compelling, understandable, and meaningful and impactful sermon for God's people. I think there's been a lot of loss of the vision of the role of theology and good exegesis for the church. And so influenced by a number of guys from an organization called the Center for Pastor Theologians, and really kind of reviving that vision. And so that's sort of the mold that I see myself in. So I do everything pastors do. I mentioned before off the air, I spent all day at the hospital with a family who lost a baby today, and just being there with them, and then the rest of the week I'm going to prepare to give an exposition. We're doing a sermon series on prayer right now and trying to recapture a vision of corporate prayer for our church, and meetings and all that stuff, and then try to squeeze in as much time as I can to study theology and exegesis. And particularly, I've found myself caught up in a love for the Second Temple Jewish context of the New Testament, and that's what I wrote my master's thesis on, what we're going to talk about, and what I had the article published on. And Lord willing, one day I'm going to get around to doing that PhD, and it will hopefully be on something relevant to the Jewish context of the New Testament. That's a huge interest of mine.
All right, man. As I always do with my guests, man, I'm praying for you, man. Keep you in my prayers and everything. So continue to do your thing for the body of Christ, man. It's important, and don't grow weary in well doing. So hopefully God will open up doors so you can get that PhD, man. It's all good. It's all good, man.
Yeah.
So with that said, man, so how did you find yourself desiring to study this? Like, what about this that made that light bulb go on top of your head and say, you know what, this is where I want to emphasize my study. This is where I want to get my master's in theology in. Like, this is where it's at. What do you think?
Yeah. So when I did 4 years in the Marine Corps, and got out in 2008 to go to Bible college, and I had planned to go on to seminary after that, and I did a undergraduate degree in biblical studies, and then the THM in New Testament. My very first Bible class was a New Testament survey course, and our first assignment was to read through the book of First Maccabees, and it was the first time I had been really exposed in any positive way to trying to understand the history and setting of Jewish theology, and the historical circumstances that gave rise to the different groups in Judaism and the different visions for what God was still doing with Israel, and it's into that world that Jesus stepped into, and it's into that world that Paul understood his calling when he was blinded on the road to Damascus. And so kind of a gateway drug for me for further study was N.T. Wright. He's a guy who a lot of evangelicals find themselves either because they're told they're supposed to hate him, or because they read them for themselves and they love him. And I have a love-hate relationship with the guy, but not very much hate, mostly love. But a lot of guys in Reformed and those sorts of evangelical circles don't care for him too much. But he's an interesting character and a very interesting writer, and he's really helped a lot of evangelicals find their way into the Jewish world of the New Testament, which I think is very, very important. And being that I had come from a Reformed sort of Baptistic background, I always found myself interested in the subject of predestination and election. I know some people find it boring nowadays, but I've always just found it fascinating. And it's an issue that's as old as the discipline of philosophy and theology. As long as people have been thinking about these things, they've wrestled with how human responsibility and divine sovereignty or fate relate to one another. And so as I got more acquainted in my graduate studies with the Jewish context of the New Testament, I found myself having read a couple of books, very interested in the relevant Jewish background to texts in Paul that tend to be cruxes of this issue. Romans 9, Ephesians 1, passages like that, and being amazed to see some really interesting parallels in some Jewish texts, and also, I should say, texts that seem to be presenting a very clearly opposite view to what I think Paul is presenting in those passages. So it made me realize that there's a huge diversity there in the Jewish sources, and understanding that diversity can help you situate in context the Apostle Paul's words or Jesus' words, and give you a better appreciation for what's going on there. And so that was where my engagement with Thornhill's book came in, which maybe we'll talk about a little later. But I haven't looked back at that since. I still am learning all the time from that Jewish context. It just helps you, understand the arena you're playing in when you do New Testament theology.
Yeah, I would say, perhaps some of the fear or some of the reason why people don't dive into these books, like the first Maccabees, second Maccabees, things like that. Perhaps there's a fear there. You know what I mean? Perhaps they're like, well, me being a Christian, I'm not supposed to be diving into these books. That's not a part of the biblical canon. It's not divine writings. But I guess people would miss the idea that there's still some great historical context associated with these books.
Exactly.
From a historical standpoint, at the very least, these books should be definitely taken into consideration in anyone's study, just to, I guess, grab a much more realistic understanding of what the Jewish the audience at that time was dealing with, or what was going through, just to allow us to be able to understand the full circumference of what the Bible is talking about. So perhaps that's maybe some of the fear there, But
there. I encounter that fear also, and I think it's real important to say what we're not doing is laying over these Jewish texts on top of Paul, or on top of the Gospels, or on top of the book of Revelation, and saying that these texts dictate what they must mean. What we should be doing is meaningfully comparing and contrasting them, allowing the differences to speak, and those differences are important, but also noticing the similarities and how those similarities can help us answer some tough questions that again have been matters of debate among Bible believing Christians for thousands of years now. And so it's a great resource again for trying to understand how Jewish people thought, and then you can situate how the early Christians thought, because they were Jews. The New Testament is a collection of Second Temple Jewish texts. It's part of that historical milieu. We judge it with authority. We treat it with authority. But understanding that authority means understanding it in its own context, and that Jewish context is essential for doing that. We're going to fail. We're gonna make some mistakes if we're not taking account of that.
Interesting. So we're going to jump into the context of this topic. Okay, so the context of what you're writing of this journal article was dealing with Thornhill's work, correct? And he came to the conclusion that predestination election was conditional, and so you said, well, obviously I disagree. And so you step in, you write a journal article critiquing his position, and then going on and arguing for your position why predestination election is unconditional. And so I was reading it, and I'm like, okay, so I see this idea of double predestination. This idea of double predestination. God is foreordained. The things that are going around, the things that are happening, he has foreordained or decreed in his sovereign will, sovereign desire for certain things to play out, for things to play out in his favor and for his glory. So what I want you to do is, obviously, I don't want you to just go head first into what we're talking about. I do want to allow you to give the audience sort of a overview of what's going on. So I have my second question for you would be considering sort of defining what we're going to be talking about. So what is the Sirach writings, and what is, I know Qumran is a location, right, where I guess this group of Israelites were settled in, and the treatises, the Treaties of Two Spirits, the Thanksgiving hymn. So go into that, define that for us, and let us know. Then we'll go ahead and dive into what you're arguing.
Okay, yeah. So as you said, Thornhill, in his book, it's called The Chosen People. It's published by InterVarsity Press. He argued that a careful survey of the Second Temple Jewish literature showed that no Jews in that period believed that election entailed the divine predestination of individuals for covenant membership and eschatological salvation. Basically, he said there were no Jewish Calvinists. Actually, I think there's a huge glaring issue with that from the get-go, and it involved him reading a couple of texts, important texts that pretty much all scholars, him and one or two others, read differently, but all other scholars recognize are strongly predestinarian. And if I can show you my screen here real quick, let me just do that. I'll just show a quick section from Josephus for the audience. Are you able to pull that up, or do I need to go to share screen? Okay, you got it there. I see it.
Yeah.
So this is a section from Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, contemporary with the New Testament authors. He was part of the Jewish revolt that led to the destruction of the Second Temple, and he ended up flipping and becoming loyal to Rome. He was a Jewish general in the war before that. But he talks about these three sects among the Jews at that time, because what he's trying to do in Antiquities is endear Judaism to a Greek-speaking Roman audience. So he's trying to explain to them what the Jewish people believe, because the Jewish people were this, weird group of individuals, from out in Judea, and not a lot of people in Rome understood them. They were just kind of odd. So he talks about how there were these three sects, and most people are probably familiar with them. You had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Pharisees and the Sadducees Pharisees are mentioned by name numerous times, especially in the Gospels. And the Essenes are not mentioned, which is an interesting silence there, that they're not mentioned because they were a prominent group. But here he explains their different beliefs with reference to how they understood the relationship between free will, and he uses the term fate. And by fate, he means divine providence. But he's using the term fate because he's talking to, again, people who are influenced by Greek ideology. And so you had the question of fate versus free will there. And so he's using the term fate, but read in that divine providence, because he's a good monotheistic Jew. So he says the Pharisees say that some actions, but not all, are the work of fate, and some of them are in our own power, and that they are liable to fate, but are not caused by fate, right? So the Pharisees kind of live in this unresolved tension of fate and free will. And then he says quickly, and this is the point that we should highlight with the Essenes. He says, but the sect of the Essenes affirm that fate governs all things, and that nothing befalls men but what is according to its determination. And then he goes on to contrast that with the Sadducees, who don't believe that fate has any impact and that everything that happens is a matter of free will. So right there, Josephus gives us sort of this taxonomy of different Jewish beliefs. So there was everything in the spectrum you can imagine, from extremely focused on divine determinism all the way to sort of a deist kind of free will affirming system, and everything in between with the Pharisees. So already a scholar should go to the Jewish sources themselves and expect to find a diversity. So for Thornhill to have said, well, there are no predestinarian election sorts of text, just runs right in the face of what Josephus says very, very plainly here. So with that, I went into especially 3 texts that I think are important. I could have gone into some more, but it's a journal article, so I had to pick what I thought was the most important material. And 2 of them are Essene texts. So those are passages from important sectarian writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So as you said, they were produced by the community that inhabited Qumran, and they were sort of a escapist kind of sect. They basically said all the Jewish people are on their way to hell in a handbasket. We're the true new covenant people. We're the true keepers of the law. The temple is defective. Everything that's going on over there is just going to lead to judgment, and that's why there are Gentiles in the land. We need to get out and practice the faith the right way. And cut ourselves off from what's going on with there. And they were, I should say, it's important that they didn't represent all the Essenes, but they were kind of probably an extremist sect in the Essene community, the community that was at Qumran, that is. Okay. And so they wrote a number of texts that were produced there. And the 2 important ones that I highlight is a section of a document called the Community Rule, which if you're reading a book on this stuff, it'll be referenced as 1QS. And it is sort of a older scholars called it the Manual of Discipline. It's almost like a church manual or and doctrinal statement for the sect or something like that. And it's got this section in it called the Treatise on the Two Spirits, which is a strongly predestinarian text that talks about God at creation assigning to each human being either the spirit of light or the spirit of darkness, and which human being he gives authority in an individual's life determines their fate, either for eternal glory or eternal condemnation. And there's some debate about whether they believed in eternal conscious punishment or annihilation. But either way, this is a double predestinarian text. Then you also have another text called the Thanksgiving hymns, or sometimes you'll see it called the Hodayot, which is the Hebrew term for Thanksgiving hymns. And it's abbreviated as 1QH in text. And particularly in columns 7 and 9, there are these really strong predestinarian themes that come up. And you still have my text up there. Let me just read one for for you guys, and we can come back to these, but just to see how strong they are. This is from column 7, which is the strongest one. He says, um, I know by your understanding that it is not by human strength. A man's way is not in himself, nor is a person able to determine his step. But I know that in your hand is the inclination of every spirit. He's talking about the human will, the human desire, and all his works. You have determined before ever you created him. How shall any be able to change your words? You alone have created the righteous one, and from the womb you established him to give heed to your covenant and appointed a time of grace for him, or a time of grace, and to walk in all things, nourishing himself, etc. And then he talks about him being raised to glory above the mortal. But then he contrasts that. He says, but the wicked you created for the time of your wrath, and from the womb set them apart for the day of slaughter. And I spell all this out in the article as it goes on. But clearly you have this divine determinism at work here, where God creates one who will eventually be raised to glory, and the other who is set apart for the day of slaughter. It couldn't be more explicit than this.
Yeah.
And then the last one is the most ancient, and that's a text from Sirach 33. And Sirach is very interesting because it's not an Essene text, and in fact, if your viewers are to read up on this, you'll find differences of opinion about what Sirach argues or emphasizes most. And some will say he is the quintessential Sadducee, because there are two texts in Sirach 15 and in Sirach 17 that seem to be very, very strong and explicit affirmations of something like libertarian free will. But then there's also a number of texts that seem to speak of divine determinism on my reading. And I argue that a determinist reading is very plausible for the whole book, but more importantly, that some Jews, namely the Essenes, did read Sirach very explicitly in that way. And maybe we can go into the text in detail. I think Sirach 33 is very important as an influence for Paul in Romans 9, and it's explicitly predestinarian, having to do with just that election there is framed in terms of God choosing individuals, and that election being the cause of their coming into the covenant and thereby receiving eschatological life. So this is a view that was out there in the air that Paul and the other New Testament writers breathed. And so what we have to do is read these texts, and then read Paul, read the Gospels, read Peter, read Revelation, and try to see where they fall on that spectrum, in comparing them with other Jewish texts. And my argument is that when we do that, particularly with Paul, he shares this a lot of this idiosyncratic predestinarian language. He doesn't seem to be opposing it. He seems to be taking up very, very similar language and employing it in some similar rhetorical contexts to argue for divine determinism causing our covenant membership and resulting in our eschatological salvation.
That's extremely interesting. As soon as you was reading that, I was thinking about Romans chapter 9. The whole going through connecting that.
Yeah, that's why I read it. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting. I guess my question would be, how do we know that Paul the Apostle is actually connected to it? Like, how can we have solid confirmation that Paul the Apostle actually did dive into this, or was connected to this in that kind of intimate fashion, to where he would actually use it in his language and write in the book of Romans Romans chapter 9. Now, how do we know that?
Yeah. So in the case of Sirach 33, I think if you compare that to Romans chapter 9, it looks like he's influenced by it. And there's no question that, especially since he was using the Septuagint, which included the books that we call the Apocrypha, that would have been something that would have influenced him. He was a Hellenistic Jew. He was from Tarsus. And, he spent a lot of time, obviously, in Jerusalem as well. But this is just something that was a tradition that was just common, and especially him, because he was a scholar. He was a well-trained Pharisee. He would have been familiar with these traditions. With regard to the Dead Sea Scrolls, I don't think any scholar would say, yes, Paul read the treatise on the dead on the two spirits, or Paul read the Qumran text. What I think they will say, and what scholars definitely do say, is that people who lived in Jerusalem ran into Essenes all the time. It was part of the Jewish debates of the day. Paul talks about after his conversion how he spent time in Damascus, and we know that the Essenes were big in Damascus as well. That was an important site for their movement. And when we compare this language, it sounds very much like he's been influenced by a similar kind of theology. So for example, Ephesians chapter 1, 3 through 14 is presented exactly as the Thanksgiving hymns are in the text. So they start out with things like, blessed are you, O God, or blessed are you, O Lord. And that's what we have. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So I've described Ephesians 1 as a Christian Thanksgiving hymn. And it also takes up many of the same themes, and not just predestination, but Paul's theology of the church as the new covenant community, and his the practice of baptism and libations and the Lord's Supper, these community meals and repentance and conversion and things like that. There are a number of really fascinating parallels. So I wouldn't talk about literary dependence. That's different. I'm not saying Paul is quoting the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think that there's huge amounts of evidence that he shows the marks of having been influenced by that ideology. And I could point to a lot of secondary literature that makes just that case. It's actually an interesting fact that among Jewish New Testament scholars, so not Christians, but Jewish New Testament scholars, they are very willing to say Paul's election and predestination discourse is just like the Essenes. And I quote them in the article, but guys like David Flusser and who's the other guy? Megan Broshi is a Jewish scholar, and another Alexander, who was a scholar at Oxford for a long time, a big name in the Dead Sea Scrolls literature. All these folks are saying, "Yep, this is where we need to put Paul in this kind of determinist end of the spectrum." So, anyways, yeah, and they all tie it to influence by Essene ideology.
Okay. Interesting. So I guess we talk about a little bit about the Qumran community. So tell me about that community. Tell me what you know about that community and how they connect, how they connected in the grand scheme of things. When we start diving into this community, like how do they connect everything? How do they connect the dots, if you will?
Yeah. So they were led by a figure who's called the Teacher of Righteousness in the text, and he was this big personality who sort of led that movement. And it's hard to reconstruct because, sort of like, what we do in exegesis of Paul, like you read Galatians and you're trying to understand who his opponents were, and it could get tricky. And we're doing the same thing when we read the Dead Sea Scrolls. But from what we can tell is he was probably a member of the priesthood, and was somehow there was a conflict, and we know about some of these from texts like it's prophesied in Daniel 11, and we know about some of this stuff from the book of First Maccabees. This is really great context for folks, and it essentially once he got kind of hosed in this dispute, he eventually leads this movement kind of as a separatist movement. And so they understood themselves to be the real true priestly community, because they saw the priesthood as having been corrupt and essentially, being offered to the highest bidder. And so the cult that was going on at Jerusalem was completely corrupt, and its sacrifices were ineffectual. And they began to talk about themselves as the new community, the new covenant community. And they said that they themselves had the Holy Spirit, which is interesting. Other Jews at the time period, besides the Christians, did not talk about themselves as a new covenant community. They were still looking forward to the new covenant community. It's only Qumran and the early Christians who said the new covenant community is here and it's us, and we have the Holy Spirit. Our hearts have been circumcised. We've been made right with God, and even there are parallels to Paul's justification language and all of this. And so one scholar who's really important to my mind on the history of the Qumran community in particular is he teaches at the University of Michigan. His name is Gabriel Boccaccini, and he connects the Essenes with the broader apocalyptic Jewish community. So the community that produced texts like the book of First Enoch, for instance, which is a collection of apocalypses. He sees the Essenes at Qumran as part of this larger apocalyptic Jewish movement. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. So I would point people to that book. It's called Beyond the Essene Hypothesis. Very, very good book for kind of helping, to me, in a really plausible way, put together things that we're trying to reconstruct from history. But there are different scholarly points of view.
All right. That's good stuff. So why should anyone accept these writings? You know what I mean? Obviously they're not canon. So why should anyone say, this is positive? Because when we're dealing with the doctrine of double predestination, man, we're talking about a doctrine that has created controversy for quite some time. So when we're saying that these texts are helping my position to argue for double predestination, why should anyone accept that as reasonable evidence? When somebody could easily say, well, while you're surfacing over these, Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm going to go to the Bible. I'm going to go with the Bible says. So what would be your response to that, Mr. Wiesner?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a modified illustration that my professor at Dallas Seminary, Darrell Bach, used to give, and you'll appreciate the modification. So say 2,000 years from now, America is gone. It got, buried in, nuclear war, God forbid, and there's just remains and dust left, and archaeologists come and dig up remains, right? And they discover a piece of paper, and on that paper it says, last night the Cowboys massacred the Raiders in Big D. Okay. And they read that, and they're experts in 21st century English, they're scholars, and they say, okay, well, we know what a cowboy is, we know what a raider is. This is weird. Big D. What is Big D? Well, are they going to go and find the right information and interpret that correctly by looking it up in a lexicon? Or are they going to need to know something about our culture and our idioms and our expressions, right? You and I hear that, and we know exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about the Cowboys whooping the Raiders in a football game, right? In Dallas, okay? Whereas, or vice versa. You can have it vice versa if you want. But that's what we're doing with this is that words have meanings in context, and cultures have idioms and ways of expressing things. And so you cannot, as 21st century Americans, pick up the New Testament and read it without an appreciation for that culture and expect that you're going to come away with an accurate interpretation. I believe in the clarity of Scripture. I believe in its truthfulness. Proverbs 30 verse 5 says, every word of God proves true. But in order to find that divinely inspired meaning, that God-breathed sense, what we have to do is do hard work at determining authorial intent. And the authors of the New Testament are Second Temple Jews. And so we can try to understand by getting not only their writings themselves, the New Testament documents, but also the writings of other Jewish authors in the time, and by comparing them and taking in all that information, they can help shed light on the text. Again, we're not taking the Dead Sea Scrolls. I would never say this, that we're taking the Dead Sea Scrolls as an authority over or even on par with the New Testament. It's not an authority in that way. It's context. It's giving me an understanding of how terms were used, how Jewish people thought, what kinds of theologies were debated, so that I can then situate the New Testament text in question in a context and try to make better sense of it. And sometimes they're really, really helpful, and sometimes they muddy things up even more. That's part of the struggle of good exegesis. So that's the way I'd answer that question.
All right, so we dove into it a little bit about Thornhill's, where he misses the point. All right, so if you can go over that one more time, just to allow for a better context of what we're dealing with here. Sure. What was it that Thornhill actually missed, that you felt that he missed the point on when it comes to this subject?
Yeah, so there's a few things I'd say. So he said essentially that the Jewish sources talk about election as conditional. Essentially, God chose a community, and as long as we are a part of that community, we're elect. But those who are not a part of that community are not elect. And this sounds a lot like Arminian corporate election, that election is conditioned on our decision to align ourselves with this community. And there are a number of metaphors, things like a remnant motif and stuff that play into that. And what I think he missed was these texts that talk about even the active conversion of joining the elect community is a result of divine predestination in some of these texts, and seems to be in Paul. And what was an interesting oversight. So first thing is, I would say that the Dead Sea Scrolls, the two texts that are the most explicitly predestinarian, the sermon on, or treatise on the two spirits, and 1QH, the Thanksgiving hymns, he adopts a reading of one of the treatise on the two spirits that he's dependent on another scholar named Mark Elliott, who wrote a really good, very big book called The Survivors of Israel. So he's dependent on him there, but Elliott adopts a reading on that isn't widely accepted. I haven't found another scholar, in fact, besides Thornhill, who follows him there. So again, I think if you just read the text, and it's very long, or I'd read it right now, but I invite people to get an English copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls and read that. It's very, very strongly and very, very clearly predestinarian in the minds of pretty much every expert in this field, and I could cite dozens of them. And then same thing with the Thanksgiving hymns. And as you said, it sounded a lot like Romans 9 when I was reading 1QH7 there. And what he does there is says, well, yeah, this sounds really predestinarian, but let's look at this genre. This is poetry. This is worship. So of course it's extravagant and hyperbolic, and they didn't really believe this stuff. And I just think that's a misunderstanding of this sort of worship and poetry genre. So we're thinking in a context where everybody we know can read. But in first century Judaism, most of the people in this group would not have been able to read. And even if they could, they wouldn't have been able to afford to have a copy of this important document for their worship. So these songs, these hymns, were used for catechesis. They were ways to train new members of the sect in the theology of the group. And so just like I could tell a lot about the theological values of your church by participating in worship and listening to the songs that you sing, these hymns become a very important expression or repository of their theology. And so we can't just write it off and say, well, this is worship material, and even though it sounds very deterministic, that can't be what they held to. And so again, that's out of step with what most scholars think anyways. And so I think we need to take those seriously. And those happen also to be, like I said, in the Jewish material, the clearest parallels to Paul's election and predestination language that we find anywhere. And so that's what I think he missed, and why his results were overstated and really neglect the value of some of this really important evidence.
Interesting, man. So we also want to talk about the Jeremiah 18, the powder and the clay motif. So sure. When we take that into consideration, you've said that there's no way that Ben Sirus, am I pronouncing his name right? Sirus?
Yeah.
Sirus, yeah. Ben Sirus, our Sirah, theology could not have pointed to Jeremiah 18, right? Yeah. But you're saying that it's pointed to Romans chapter 9, that double predestinate theology, God having the ability to mold or to make pots or to make vessels of wrath, vessels of righteousness. So go into that a little bit and explain to us how that is not pointing to Jeremiah 18.
Okay, so can you go back to my screen real quick?
Yeah, I sure can. Let me pull it up real quick.
Okay.
And
so this is as you're doing that, this is short enough that we could go ahead and read it here. So this is Sirach chapter 33, and we're looking at 7 through I think verse 15. Okay, so he says, why is one day more important than another when all the daylight in the year is from the sun? And he says, by the Lord's wisdom, they were distinguished. He appointed different seasons and festivals. And then he says, some days he exalted and hallowed, and some he made ordinary days. And so that he's introducing an analogy there in order to compare them with the situation of humans. So he talks about exalted and hallowed days and then ordinary days. And so now he's going to make a comparison between exalted, hallowed, elect, chosen, individuals versus non-elect individuals. So this is where he does that in verse 10. He says, all human beings come from the ground, and humankind was created out of the dust. So we all have the same origins. Verse 11, in the fullness of his knowledge, the Lord distinguished them and appointed their different ways. And their ways are their paths, their destinies, where they're headed. So this is what we call in Jewish wisdom literature two ways ideology. There's the way of righteousness and the way of wickedness. Think Psalm 1, okay? Mm-hmm. And so he says, some he blessed and exalted, and some he made holy and brought near to himself. And this is all covenant language. This is language about him making people covenant members. But others he cursed and brought low and turned out of their place. And then here's the potter clay stuff, verse 13. Okay. Like clay in the hand of the potter, so he molds as he pleases. And this Greek phrase, as he pleases, is the same language exactly in Greek that Paul uses in Ephesians chapter 1. And he uses similar phrases in Romans 8 and 9. According to his good pleasure is how it might get rendered in some other English translations. Likewise with whatever he decides here. So, excuse me. So all are in the hand of their maker. And this image of the hand means in his power and to be given whatever he decides. Now, this is set up in a creational context. This isn't talking about God conditionally judging and conditionally blessing, as some people would like to argue, because look at verse 14 and 15. Good is the opposite of evil, and life the opposite of death. So the sinner, so we're talking about individuals here, so the sinner is the opposite of the godly. Look at the works of the Most High. They come in pairs, one the opposite of the other. So what he's saying is, this is the way God is created. God creates in pairs, in these opposites. There's good and evil, there's life, there's death, and there's sinner and godly. Why? Because that's the way God creates. That's how we understand why some are elect and find themselves in the covenant and others are not. It all goes back to God creating like a potter. Now, you talked about Jeremiah 18. What some people will do, and this tends to be kind of a move of convenience, is they'll go to Jeremiah 18, where Jeremiah does use the potter, a different kind of potter clay analogy. And what we need to do is pay attention to Jeremiah's rhetorical points, because he's not doing what Ben Sira is doing here. Ben Sira is talking about creation and why there are the evil and the righteous, right? Jeremiah is not doing that. Jeremiah is talking to the people of Judah who are on their way into exile and are wondering whether or not it's even some repentance is something they even need to worry about. And so Jeremiah is talking about God's power to put them on a path back to covenant blessing. So what he's saying is, you just need to worry about repenting. You guys are worried about all this, being cursed because of your parents, but you need to take ownership and you need to repent. God can do what a potter does and smash that clay up and repurpose it and create a different path than the one it looks like you're headed on. All you need to do is look to him for repentance. He's not giving a theological treatise there about divine determinism versus free will, like what we're getting with Ben Sira here. So really better background for Sirach 33 we find in Isaiah 29 and Isaiah 45, where it talks about vessels that God has made, answering back to him and questioning God's inscrutable will. And those are the texts, interestingly, that Paul cites specifically in Romans chapter 9. We can, I still have that up here. I'll show you that here.
Okay.
Let's see here. Romans 9. Sorry, and I don't usually use this translation, but because I was looking at Ben Sira, it's the one that I have. So looking at verse 20. Okay, yeah. So but who indeed are you, a human being, to argue with God? Well, what is molded, say to the one who molded it, why have you made me like this? And then he says, has not the potter right over the clay to make out of the same lump, and that's language like what we get in Ben Sira, make out of the same lump one object for special use and another for ordinary use. And that's the contrast that's going on there in Sirach 33. And if you look at marginal notes in your text for verse 20, they're going to point you to Isaiah 29:16, if I'm remembering correctly, and 45:9. Yeah, why not? We'll look it up here. Let me just double check. Isaiah 29:16. Let's see here. Okay. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay? Shall the thing made say of its maker, he did not make me? Or the thing formed say to the one to form, he has no understanding. Right. And then 45:9. So essentially what most scholars think is
Isaiah 45:9.
Yes. And so here he says, woe to you who strive with your maker, earthen vessels with the potter. Does the clay say to the one who fashions it, what are you making? Or your work has no handles, et cetera, et cetera. So this is about the inscrutability of God's righteous will to do what he wants with human beings, particularly Israel here, as he sees fit, and that they stand on no grounds as the thing made in questioning the potter's wisdom, his rights, his authority to do what he will. And that is precisely in the realm of what's going on in Sirach 33, and that's very different from what's going on with Jeremiah 18. So we need to recognize that the potter clay analogy can and is used in different ways, and we need to see, and it's very clear from what Paul actually cites. He cites Isaiah, not Jeremiah, and he sounds like Sirach, not Jeremiah. So there's just no good basis for jumping to Jeremiah and undoing, I think, just making a mess of what Paul actually said.
Interesting, man. That's good stuff right there, man. You know, you always, I mean, we got folks in the audience right now who are chopping at you a little bit about about reading Sirach and
probably good.
Yeah, right. Sirach, using Sirach to confirm, I guess, in a way anyway, what Paul has written, making the connection between Sirach and what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 9. So that's that's very interesting to me. You know, we're always looking for ways to try to confirm in some manner if we're interpreting this correctly. You know, and a part of our job as interpreters is to make sure we're practicing the art and science of hermeneutics correctly. And a part of that is taking everything into consideration, the context. You know, what's the narrative of the book? You know what I mean? So, and as you pointed out, you know, and I think you did a great job at it, is pointing out how we can connect texts like the New Testament text, who at first glance you would say, man, this has nothing to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, our first mindset, you know, we're like, you know, Old Testament is, you know, we connect the Old Testament to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not a New Testament text. No way, you know. So that's always interesting when we see this and able to connect these things. So I guess my next question would be, let me get my questions back up. My next question would be concerning the Treaties of the Two Spirits, right? So okay, so once again, you know, this is a very controversial thing. You know, so you have a point where I think you touched on it earlier about the Treaties of the Two Spirits, where there's the spirit of light and there's a spirit of darkness. So I have my question is, before you go into that and explain it a little bit, I do want to say, I do want you to sort of, I guess, clarify some the idea of that. Does that not touch on, I guess, maybe a little bit of equal ultimacy? Do you think it touches on that in a way, in some variance of a way? What do you think about that?
Yeah, when I hear people say the term equal ultimacy or deny their affirmation of it, I wonder what they mean, because I don't think they mean that the fates are not equally set and equally determined. What I think they mean is, what I would affirm is that they're not precisely parallel. So when we talk about election to covenant membership and eschatological salvation, we talk about that as entirely unconditional. There's nothing that the the elect person does in order to be deserving of that, right? So they're not being blessed for good that they did, or rewarded in any such way. Whereas with reprobation or condemnation, they do meet certain conditions, and that is that they're sinful, right? They will be judged according to what they have done. That's what Paul says, and I think that's what the community at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the author of the Dead Sea Scrolls, said as well. So even with this, and it does ultimately ground it in creation, and this is a theological point that I think people have a hard time coming face to face with this. If you are a monotheist and you believe that God is the sole creator, and that he knew perfectly well the exact shape that his creation would take when he
Mm.
created the way that he created, then determinism necessarily follows. And a lot
Yeah.
of folks don't like that, but just there's no philosophical out to that. If God created and he had perfect knowledge of what would result from his creation, it resulted that way because of the way he created. And if he didn't want it to result that way, he could have created it differently, and then it would have resulted in the way that he wanted it to result in that other way of having created, etc. You get the point. There's a line of causation from everything that happens in time and history that goes back to that act of creation, and there's no theological, philosophical way to get out of that, to my mind,
Mm.
unless you deny, as open theists do, the exhaustive foreknowledge of God, which I'd say, hey, that's philosophically, that's the best response to Calvinism. I think that the other systems really want to kind of have their cake and eat it too, and I understand why
Yeah.
they want that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that determinism is always a nice comfy pillow. Like there are some really hard pills that you have to swallow, but I think it's something that we can't avoid affirming with the biblical witness. So, but we do get that sort of again. There's those two sides to God's determinism that are very
Mhm.
explicit in the treatise on the two spirits. And I want to make this point that Paul's determinism, again, is not exactly the same in every respect. So this is just showing us that there is this strongly predestinarian group on the spectrum that had ideas that were on offer for the earliest Christians to help them understand how the gospel comes to be effective for believers in Jesus. Okay, so it's not to say that Paul would have said, yeah, that's what I think. All this spirit stuff. Although there is an interesting parallel in Second Thessalonians chapter 2 that sounds remarkably similar in a number of ways to what's going on with the treatise on the two spirits. But did you want me to go into that text a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, you can go into that text a little bit and sort of explain
Sure.
exactly what's going on there and its connection to the Pauline writings.
Okay. Okay. So this one again, this is the one that I would say is the hardest to connect back to Paul, but there are some texts to me that sound like Paul is operating in this sphere. So let me just make that caveat, and I want to be sincere and work with some integrity about that. So this is the text right here. So it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you don't have chapters and verses, you have columns and lines. Okay, so this starts in column 3 of the community rule, line 13, and it goes through column 4, line 26, if I remember correctly. And essentially, you get You get an introduction at the beginning of it. This is a text belonging to the instructor, who is to enlighten and teach all the sons of light about the character and fate of humankind, all their spiritual varieties with accompanying signs, their deeds, generation by generation, and their visitation for the afflictions together with eras of peace. And this is what he says. He says, and all that is now and ever shall be originates with the God of knowledge. Before things come to be, he has ordered all their designs, so that even when they do come to exist at their appointed times, as his as ordained by his glorious plan, they fulfill their destiny, a destiny impossible to change. And he talks about how he controls the laws, etc. And then he goes on to talk about how there are these two spirits that are given to govern humanity, and he talks about them as the spirit of light and the spirit of darkness, or the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood. And then he even uses this language of the angel of darkness, things like that, and here the authority of the prince of light, right? And things like that. So there are a number of names and titles that are used throughout that are touching on that same reality, that at creation God marks individuals with one or the other to govern them. And really, as you read the text, they have a very strong view of depravity, way more colorful than anything that we can find in the New Testament. Just human beings are just shameful and evil, and so all of humanity is touched in a certain way by the spirit of darkness. But what God does with the spirit of light is to purify those chosen completely from the stains of the spirit of darkness. So as the text goes on, it talks about you see some interesting language in here that you find in Paul. So he talks about the authority of the angel of darkness extending to the corruption of all the righteous. As I was just saying, it touches them. Their sins, their iniquity, shameful and rebellious deeds are at his prompting, a situation that God in his mystery allows to continue until his era dawns. So they saw this eschatological age that would come on where this angel of darkness would lose his power over God's elect people. And so we get that language of us having been delivered from the dominion of darkness and transferred into the kingdom of his beloved son in Paul in Colossians chapter 2, and also in Peter. And so anyways, he goes on to talk about these spirits. He says God's love for the one spirit lasts forever. He is pleased with its actions for always. The counsel of the other, however, he abhors, hating its every impulse. It talks about how he enlightens a man's mind, making straight before him the paths of true righteousness and causing his heart to fear the law of God. And that gets into that two ways idea, and he goes on to frame this up in covenantal terms in this same section. I'm sorry, I'm going over a lot just because I don't want to read the whole thing, but he talks about here the depravity at work in the those who have the spirit of falsehood, greed, neglect of righteous deeds, wickedness, lying, pride, haughtiness, cruel deceit, fraud, hypocrisy, want of self-control. That kind of sounds like the works of the flesh in Galatians chapter 5, right? Deceit and ignorance and all that stuff. And then he talks about how their judgment will be afflictions at the hand of the angels of perdition, everlasting damnation, and the wrath of God's furious vengeance, never-ending terror and reproach for all eternity, with a shameful extinction in the fires of hell's outer darkness, etc., etc. And then he goes on to talk about how, in contrast, by his truth, God will purify all human deeds and refine some of humanity so as to extinguish every perverse spirit from the inward part. So there's only elect, an elect, remnant of humanity who are given this spirit, and it's very clear that this is about individual human destinies. As it concludes, he says, God has appointed these spirits as equals until the time of the decree and renewal. He foreknows their outworking, and foreknowledge in in the Dead Sea Scrolls is very much is for determining, and I'll point that out when we get to the Thanksgiving hymns later and show how clear that is. But he foreknows the outworking of their deeds for all the ages. He has granted them dominion over humanity. So imparting knowledge of good and evil, deciding the fate of every living being by the measure of which spirit predominates in him until the day of the appointed visitation. So it's framed up in these eschatological categories that sound a lot like what's going on in some New Testament texts. And the text that I would say that most clearly sounds like this is, and actually here, I'm going to pull up my translation of this because I actually gave a presentation on this to some pastor friends not too long ago. Sorry, 1 second. Let me get this here. So this is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And this is my rendering right here of verses 9 through 14, where I'm trying to make some points about what I think is going on in Paul's Greek. But he says, the coming of the lawless one is by the working of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all the unrighteous deception to those who are perishing, because of which, so I think Paul's language indicates that he's saying because of which, rather than because they did not receive the love of the truth. So it's the deception that causes them not to receive the love of the truth, not the failure to receive the love of the truth that leads to their deception. It says, and for this reason, God sends them an operative delusion so that they will believe this falsehood. So the idea here is that God is sending this delusion and causing them to believe something that is not true in order to judge everyone who does not believe the truth but takes pleasure in unrighteousness. And in contrast, he says, but we ought to give thanks to God always concerning you, brothers beloved by the Lord, because he and this Greek term that he uses here for election, God picked you out from the beginning for salvation by sanctification of your spirit. And again, I'm making some exegetical decisions there on the grammar that we could justify. If your viewers want to dig into the Greek, we could talk about those. But the idea here is that's language of the human spirit being sanctified, being purified by God's electing choice. And he says, into which he called you through our gospel for the attainment of glory. And so this is the place where I think that there might be some parallels. But I'm mostly interested in the treatise on the two spirits, for the big picture theology of divine determinism in that regard. So I hope that's clear. There's so much there, and viewers will have to read the article if they're interested in more detail on that.
All right. Yeah, I think I touched on this a little bit as far as someone deciding to reject this because of the idea of double predestination. So what would you say to somebody that has that inclination of have this desire to just reject things that doesn't flow in line with their theological position? In essence, showing basically an area of confirmation bias. What would you say to somebody that kind of in that area?
Well, yeah, I mean, we all fight against confirmation bias, and so I think most Christians are sincerely trying to think through this stuff. I don't really like to question Christians' motives in that way, because I understand that sometimes it is difficult to get your mind around and to accept. It's a hard truth sometimes. But the idea of this duality of God's predestination, I just think it's unavoidable in Paul. Again, you get the potter clay analogy in Romans 9. You get Peter and Jude talking about people being destined to stumble at the word. You get all this language of and it's always framed up. Not always, but usually framed up with a passive verb, which scholars will tell you this is a divine passive. The Jewish authors would have used the passive voice to express succinctly that we're talking about this is what God caused to happen, And so it's really important when you're looking at Romans 9, where Paul's whole issue is the unbelief of the majority of Jewish people in his day. How does he explain that? He says it's not a matter of human will, it's not a matter of human exertion, election, but it's a matter of God's selective mercy and calling,
Yeah.
and so he calls some, and others he doesn't. He has mercy on some, and others he hardens, and we can get mad about that, but he doesn't ground it in their conditions, primarily that they have met, but he grounds it in God's free and inscrutable will and mercy and calling. So, I there's that exegetical point. What I would want somebody who had an issue with this to do with me, what I'd invite them to do, if they can read Greek, I'd say, let's open up our Greek New Testaments and sit down and let's parse some verbs, and let's analyze some syntax and see what's going on here in Paul's grammar, and I'll show you why I think this is unavoidable. If they can only read English, I'll try to explain that with them too. But we need to have our Bibles open, and we need to say, with the same heart and attitude that God's word is true, and where I disagree with it, I'm the one who needs to come to terms with that, not God. And that can be a hard journey, and I get that. But that's the place I'd want to go with them. I wouldn't want to make it a theological fight. I'd really want to make it a matter of us opening up the scriptures and trying to hear what God has to say, and approaching it with some humility, and wanting to subject our thinking, think his thoughts after him, and try to understand why it's actually good, even though it's hard to accept, but it's actually good.
Yeah, I think some of the struggle would be, the idea of double predestination will be, does God determine sin? I think that is some of the major struggle where people are attempting to protect God's holiness, and I get it. I get it. People are trying to protect God's holiness, and they don't want any of that filth of sin on God, or having God responsible for sin. So I think that's probably the major struggle. Adopting or accepting double predestination is the idea that God did also, in his mind, God's mind, beforehand, before anything was created, God had this idea of sin in his head, or that he would desire that to come about for his glory and for his righteousness, for all his glory. So I think that's the big struggle. So jumping back into this with the Thanksgiving hymn, like you pointed out a little bit that it's more of like poetry, or it has certain language to it, and we know poetry. We deal with the Psalms, we deal with Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Songs of Solomon. Yep. They have some very extravagant language. In some cases, more of a hyperbolic language. You know what I mean? Poetry is poetry. So how can we get a theological position out of a writing such as the Thanksgiving hymns? Like, how would that work? How would you derive a theological position from that?
Yeah, I would do it the same way that the New Testament authors cite various Psalms to understand who Jesus is. So the most cited Old Testament passage in the New Testament is Psalm 110, and you get Psalm 2 and all these messianic passages that are used to understand who Jesus is. This is all worship. This is all poetry, but it's theologically loaded and weighty. And in illiterate communities, it's the worship that really carries so much of their theology. And I think that was very much the case for what was going on with this community. New members had to go through a lengthy process before they were considered full members, and that involved memorizing some of this material that they couldn't read. Well, how did they memorize all this doctrine that they had to embrace? They sang these hymns. They were chanting these things, and they did that because it was genuinely representative of their theology. And that's what we already saw in the if I were to go back to the Treatise on the Two Spirits, that whole section begins by the author saying that this is a text intended to teach all the sons of light. So that predestinarian theology is what they wanted to teach new members, is what they wanted to their people to understand was distinctive to their community ideas about where they came from and why they were faithful and other Israelites weren't. So the Thanksgiving hymns uphold that same theology. and are another resource that was used to teach it to those people who were part of that community.
Interesting stuff, man. So yeah, I mean that, that's the first thing. Like in some cases, some people, some theologians, some worldviews, man, they will take a hymn or a psalm or a proverb and create a fanciful position, man, and they say, "See, this is why I believe what I believe." So I guess that was when I was reading your article. I guess that was one of my concerns. It's like, okay, should we take a hymn, and use that as a sort of an underpinning, if you will, or connection to a theological position? So I think that's important. I thank you for that response. So right now, I would like to go and fill some of these questions from the audience to see if we could tackle some of these questions. So that said, let me pull this one up. My YouTube connection, I don't know what's going on, but I'm just going to read those. But I have one for Facebook here, and I would like for you to tackle this one. And it should pop on the bottom screen. This is from Todd Clower. Thank you for chiming in. It says, wow, keep reading. Sirach 33 condones torturing slaves for punishment. Not sure we should be pulling theology from there and saying Paul was real familiar with it and teaches the same things they teach. What would be your response to that?
I mean, has he read the Old Testament where it talks about punishing slaves? I mean, I don't know. It's not to say that Paul wholesale took over everything that Sirach ever taught. We're talking about his literary use of that imagery. I'd point him to John Piper's monograph. So everybody knows Piper as an influential pastor, but before he was that, he was a very good New Testament scholar, and he wrote a monograph on Romans chapter 9 called The Justification of God. And in there, he deals with this connection to Sirach 33, and it's very, very convincing and powerful. If you could read German, there's a German scholar named Geerd Meyer who wrote a published dissertation on this. I can't read German. I did my best with it for my research and trying to get it translated and whatnot. But it's very interesting stuff. But yeah, I mean, you can find stuff you don't like in Sirach, just the way you can find stuff that bothers atheists in the Old Testament. And it should bother us. We're talking about people who are from a culture different from our own, and we don't believe that it's right to have slaves or to beat them or anything like that. I think that's a horrific idea. And but they're writing from that context, and it's the Apostle Paul who talked about people in that oppressive circumstance, obeying their masters as they obey the Lord, and so to me, it's just not outside of the realm of possibility, because there are things like that we might find offensive. It doesn't mean that he didn't utilize a similar theology, and what we need to do is set that aside and lay out Sirach 33 next to Romans chapter 9 and say, why do these look so remarkably similar? I think that's almost a way of kind of dodging the weight of the evidence itself. If we set those texts up side by side, and I'd love to walk through Romans 9, or Ephesians 1 or whatever here in a little while, but to me the weight of that is very strong.
All right. So this is coming from YouTube, and it's Spartan Theology. What is Robert's opinion on Barf's thoughts on election? I don't know, Barf. Yeah.
Man, if he could explain them to me, I might have an opinion. He's hard for me to understand. From what I understand, he talks about Christ as the elect one, and essentially, our election, through union with Christ. So I would differ from him on that. I don't think that many scholars, New Testament scholars, would find a lot of exegetical justification for his views. And I'm not just saying Calvinist New Testament scholars. I'm saying New Testament scholars in general. But I'm not an expert on Barth. I have a hard time reading him. He usually puts me to sleep, and I know that's blasphemy in some circles. But I do not pretend to have a good grasp on his election theology, and I have tried. I just have a hard time getting my mind around it. Maybe I'm not smart enough. I'm not sure, but I wish I could give a better answer to that.
All right, it's all good. It's all good. So this was coming from YouTube as well. What is your perspective on the new perspective on Paul?
Yeah. Yeah. So the new perspective is got its valuable contributions to the study of the New Testament. Particularly, it tore down the old caricatures that Jewish people didn't believe in salvation by grace. What E.P. Sanders did in his book Paul and Palestinian Judaism is show that grace was primary across all, really pretty much all of Second Temple Judaism. But it doesn't follow from that, and this is where the movement went too far. It doesn't follow from that essentially all Jewish expressions of grace are the same as what we find in the New Testament. And so some really important work that has developed from that is treatments of the new perspective in authors like John Barclay in his really important book, Paul and the Gift, and where he says, yeah, grace is everywhere, but grace is not everywhere the same. And he goes on to talk about how different Jewish authors understood grace differently. And so some authors talked about grace by emphasizing its priority, meaning God acts first. And so this is what Sanders and the New Perspective were really emphasizing, is that God first establishes the covenant and we respond through obedience to the law. But the gracious establishment of the covenant comes first, and he gives us the law, and that's how we maintain it. So he would say we get in by grace, but we stay in by works, is what Sanders would say. Well, that's not what I think we have in Paul. What we have in Paul is what Barclay called incongruity, meaning that God sets his gracious affection on people who are unworthy. And I think, and this is where I differ from Barclay, like you have in the Qumran hymns, an emphasis on the effectiveness of grace. So God's grace brings us effectually into the covenant community. When God is gracious to somebody, it's a transformative, new creation kind of grace that makes us into a holy people, marks us out as God's own, and makes us into a holy people. So I think the new perspective can give you a lot of good exegetical insights, but I would be critical of some parts of it, just as I would with a lot of Reformed scholars, and I would with another movement in Pauline scholarship called Apocalyptic Paul, which they shouldn't even have that name. If the questioner knows about the group, they're an interesting group of scholars. But I hope that answers. I think there's good insights, and there are plenty of places for critique as well. So yeah.
All right. So we have a comment from Leandre. He just want to thank you for this. I guess I think he has another comment on here saying that his professor, Brian Schultz, is an expert in Dead Sea Scrolls, Special Allied War Scrolls. I plan to quiz him about this tomorrow. So yeah, so I guess Mr. Leandre is looking into this. His professor is also a head or expert in this area, so he appreciates it and wants to thank you for that. He also asked about a link to your article. What I can do is I'll post the problem is the PDFs don't want to load up on YouTube, like a link where people can click on.
What though, I have an Academia link that I can share with you, and remind me. I'll do that before we get off, and he'll be able to take that. And I think I appreciate the kind words there, and I'm glad that it's helpful. And he'll acknowledge what I'm saying about these texts. The dispute then comes to its relevance for Paul, and that's where there are disputes among scholars. So I want to make that point clear. So I think he would see what I say about particularly about the Dead Sea Scrolls text, and be like, yeah, this is where they're at, because I thoroughly document the scholarship on that in the article. But I'd be interested in what he says beyond that as well. The Dead Sea Scrolls are lots of fun, so it's great that you have a professor who's an expert there. I just find them fascinating, so I'm glad to see you've got some interest in that as well.
Cool. And Spartan Theology actually chimed in, and we're just talking about the apocalyptic Paul, that perspective of Paul.
Okay.
It says, any thoughts on Douglas Campbell and the apocalyptic perspective? Any thoughts on that?
Man. Yeah. So, I made the point that apocalyptic is the wrong name. It's a misnomer for that group. So they believe in a very strong discontinuity between Old Testament salvation history, redemptive history, and grace in Christ. And Douglas Campbell is sort of the most extreme expression of that. So basically, he sees Romans, especially the first 3 to 5 chapters, expressing the views of Paul's opponents, which are very judicial and covenant based, and he uses a number of terms, contractual, and then but Paul's real theology we find finally in Romans 5 to 8, where he talks about participation by the Spirit in Christ, and things like this, and essentially the divide comes down to how we understand the sin problem. So for the apocalyptic school, sin is not primarily my transgressions of the divine law, but is something that is a demonic superhuman power that enslaves me. So what I need is not forgiveness of my transgressions against God's law. What I need is liberation from the power of sin. I'm a victim, not really the guilty party of sin, if that makes sense. And they make some good points there, because you do get that in Paul in Romans 5 to 8, and a little bit in 1 Corinthians 15. But you also get in Paul this idea that we need to be forgiven of our transgressions against sins. And I just don't think that there's any strong exegetical basis for excising the judicial metaphors for what they call this apocalyptic worldview. I think both work together, and interestingly, they're brought together very, very beautifully also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also in other apocalyptic literature like First Enoch. I'd like to point the questioner to a published dissertation by what was his name? I can get it here. It's called Paul Among the Apocalypses, where he compares Paul to other Jewish apocalypses to show how these themes of covenant and these apocalyptic ideas of these superhuman powers and all this, how they come together in Paul as they do in other Jewish apocalypses. It's very, very good. And also read Grant McCaskill's review of Campbell's The Deliverance of God. He really takes him to task in a really strong way in that. So this is very technical stuff that's hot debates in Pauline scholarship right now. And if I get around to doing that PhD, I plan to have my dissertation topic directly addressing the apocalyptic Paul camp. So
all right. Yeah. Cool, man. That's some exciting stuff, man. I hope you get that PhD as well, man. That's gonna be a great one, man.
Yeah,
that's gonna be a great.
Gotta let my kids grow up a little bit, so I have time to sit down and do research. So I got three young kids in the house right now. It's gonna be a few years probably, but yeah. Lord willing, we'll get around to it. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, we don't have any more questions for the audience, but I have one question for you, man. And that is the most important question of any question that we've discussed today, and that is the gospel truth. Like, what is the gospel truth?
Yeah, I would answer that question and say what Paul says in Romans 1, like 3 through 5, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead. So the gospel is that Jesus Christ is Lord. Every knee will bow to him and every tongue will confess that that's the case. And the implications of the gospel are that all who entrust themselves to Jesus, who bow the knee in allegiance and call on him as Lord, will be saved. They'll be delivered from wrath and will enjoy new creation with him for all eternity in his eternal kingdom. I think that's what the gospel truth is.
All right, man. That is the gospel truth, man. I thank you for joining me, Robert, man. This is a great conversation, great interview, and very informative, should I say. It's a very informative interview, man. This is an area that I know I haven't really touched on in my studies. So I thank you for coming on the Gospel Truth, man, giving us the lowdown and the rundown on this particular subject, man. And actually, I got an interview with JD, and I may have to tap into a little bit of this when having this discussion with JD, man. So we'll see what's going on, man. Okay. But I'll talk to you soon, Robert. I thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Gospel Truth, man. And keep doing your thing, man. We're keeping you in prayer. And what's up?
I appreciate that, and God bless you. And I'm grateful for the questioners, and I hope I wasn't too scattered on all of it. Maybe we could do a follow up and focus on Paul a little bit more, because we spend a lot of time in the Jewish text. But I think that's probably the new stuff for most people. So thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, man, it was great. It was great. So you have a good one, Robert, and I'll be talking to you soon. All right.
Sounds good.
All right, folks, another great episode in the books, man. It's exciting stuff, man. This is an area of study that not too many people jump into, man. So it's a good thing that we do have folks out there that are willing to jump in here and give us at least a basic rundown of what we're dealing with here. It's always good, as I touched on earlier, when we're dealing with this, with hermeneutics in general. We always want to get as full of a context we could possibly get, and that will help us with our hermeneutics, right? Being able to interpret the text. So I think this is precisely what we're dealing with when we jump into the Dead Sea Scrolls and we jump into Sirach and the Thanksgiving hymns. I think that is helping us to be able to gather an even more, a greater understanding of the biblical text, the New Testament, right? So instead of having this idea, well, this Dead Sea Scroll or this extra biblical text doesn't agree with my theology, so I'm going to push it to the side. Let's not have confirmation bias to where we're only accepting the things that conform or confirm our position. Let's be able to dive into this stuff and see if we can be convinced that our position is wrong. And that's the point of these interviews. That's the point of these debates. I host debates, interviews, and Bible lessons, do this thing. And that's the point of it, right? We are, as believers, and when we engage brothers and sisters in Christ in these type of topics, a subject of double predestination, that's obviously an in-house debate, right? So when we engage in our brothers and sisters in this topic, we are to do that with an open heart and try to be as objective and open as possible. Obviously, we all have our biases, we all have our positions, but let's try to be open to where, perhaps what I've held to for 10 years is wrong. Perhaps it's wrong. Maybe I should make a change, And so that's I guess the primary objective that you should have when you approach these subject matters. So I thank Robert for coming on, man. And it's always exciting to have guys like him on to be able to give us a rundown of this stuff. That said, as you know, I have a whole bunch of shows coming up here in the future. Tomorrow, I'll be jumping back on, and I'll be doing a discussion on what is Pelagianism. All right. Very important that we understand what it looks like, what it is, and how we can detect it so we can refuse that nonsense and get it out the church, man. We need to be able to stand firm in the faith and be able to reject ideas such as Pelagianism, because it's not biblical. All right. So I'll be back on at about 1:15 tomorrow p.m. and that's 4:15 Eastern Standard Time. So make sure that you're on the lookout for that, and hopefully you can join me when we jump into that. All right. I thank you for joining me on this episode of Gospel Truth. Make sure you're liking, make sure you're subscribing as well. Hit that button, like, subscribe, and that notification bell so you can stay in the loop with the Gospel Truth has going on. With that said, I thank you. May God bless you, and may God keep you. Gone.